Pamela Cross pointed across the clubhouse table and accused me of frightening an entire neighborhood. My attorney didn't argue. She simply unfolded the county map. The red boundary wrapped around 247 acres, and inside it sat 318 homes, 2 private roads, a clubhouse, a pool, tennis courts, and a lake. Then Rachel pointed to the owner of record, my family. I had inherited 1,800 acres from my grandfather. Somehow one piece of that inheritance had an entire HOA sitting on top of it. Pamela insisted there had to be a valid lease. There had been one. It had expired 7 years earlier, and when the HOA finally produced the document, supposedly extending it another 50 years, we found something that made the whole room go quiet. The signature date didn't belong to a living man. 4 months earlier, none of that was on my radar. My name is Jacob Harrison. I was 54, living outside Billings, Montana, running the kind of construction company where I still knew which truck had the bad heater and which employee would forget a tape measure if it wasn't physically attached to him. We built barns, fences, rural houses, machine sheds, useful things. My wife, Claire, and I had 2 grown sons and a dog who considered UPS deliveries a personal social event. Life was ordinary. Then my grandfather's attorney called. Benjamin Harrison had died 6 weeks earlier at 91. I knew there would be an estate. I did not expect much beyond maybe some equipment, a little money, and whatever remained of the old family ranch. Andrew Blake, his attorney, asked me to come in. His office smelled like coffee, printer toner, and old paper. He pushed a folder across the desk and said, "Your grandfather left you the remaining Harrison acreage. How much remaining?" He hesitated. That is never encouraging when a lawyer does it. Approximately 1,800 acres. I thought I'd misunderstood him. I hadn't. The land was divided among 6 tracts. Most looked exactly like what I expected. Dry pasture, rolling Montana ground, creek bottom, an equipment barn, fencing that had seen better decades. My first thought wasn't wealth, it was property tax. My second thought was fencing. My third was that 1,800 acres could produce 1,800 different ways to need money. Claire laughed when I told her, "We can barely keep the sprinkler system alive." Fair point. The following week, Andrew gave me maps, tax records, deeds, grazing leases, water paperwork, and enough folders to build a small fort. Then I drove out to inspect the parcels. The first 5 made sense. The 6th did not. Tract 6 was listed as 247 acres southeast of the main ranch. I turned off the highway expecting open ground. Instead, my tires rolled over smooth subdivision pavement. There was a stone entrance, Willow Creek Estates. Beyond it were landscaped lawns, large homes, ornamental trees, parked SUVs, and American flags moving in a warm afternoon breeze. I checked the estate map, then my phone, then the map again. The gravel I'd been driving all morning was still crunching under my boots when I stepped out beside a road that clearly hadn't been gravel in 20 years. I drove farther. Clubhouse, swimming pool, tennis courts, a small lake, rows and rows of houses. You ever have that feeling when reality and paperwork are disagreeing and you're standing there wondering which one has made the bigger mistake? That was me. I called Andrew. "Tract 6 is wrong. What do you mean? There's a neighborhood on it." He went quiet. Then he said something worse. I know. The explanation was an old ground lease arrangement. Decades earlier, Grandpa had leased the underlying tract to a developer called Western Valley Communities. The developer built Willow Creek. Homeowners acquired their houses and whatever property interests the development documents conveyed, while Grandpa's company retained the master land interest underneath the larger tract. Unusual, but not impossible. The original term was 30 years. There was an option for another 50, but the extension had to be completed properly and in writing before the original term expired. So they extended it? Andrew said. They were supposed to. That phrase bothered me. The estate file contained no extension. The county records contained no extension. Willow Creek Management eventually produced a copy bearing Grandpa's name. For about 10 minutes, that seemed to settle everything. Then Andrew noticed the notary. The document claimed it had been signed before the notary's commission even existed. We requested the original. Nobody had it. The old management company had closed. The developer was gone. And then Grandpa's former accountant, Nancy Reed, checked the payment history. Ground rent from Willow Creek had stopped exactly 7 years earlier, the same year the 30-year term ended. Even worse, Nancy found copies of letters Grandpa had sent demanding a proper extension or new agreement. He clearly did not think one existed. Then the HOA made the mistake that pulled me directly into its system. A letter arrived at my house. $500. Vegetation violation. Apparently, the open portion of Tract 6 was insufficiently maintained. I wasn't a Willow Creek homeowner. I wasn't even a member of their HOA. But their automated enforcement system had found my name in the land records and decided to fine me for the 247 acres underneath the community they were managing. I called the property manager, Scott Daniels. The fine disappeared almost immediately. Then Scott asked, very carefully, "Are you related to Benjamin Harrison?" 3 days later, Pamela Cross called personally. She was the HOA president, and she wanted me to send her my deed. That was when the $500 weed fine stopped being funny, because suddenly, Willow Creek wasn't interested in my vegetation. They were interested in what I had discovered. Andrew told me not to send Pamela anything privately. "Your ownership record is public," he said. "If she wants to verify it, she can use the same county system everyone else uses." That sounded reasonable. Pamela did not seem to enjoy reasonable. Within days, Willow Creek's attorney sent Rachel Whitaker, who Andrew had brought in to handle the property dispute, a new packet of documents. Rachel was the kind of attorney who could make a 20-page document feel nervous. She called me into her office. "They're saying your grandfather was paid to settle the ground issue." "Paid how much?" $600,000. According to Willow Creek's news story, Grandpa had accepted $600,000 in exchange for a 50-year lease extension and a waiver of future annual ground rent. That would explain why payments stopped. There was only one problem. Nancy checked everything. No $600, zeros in deposit, no wire, no check, no tax reporting that matched it, nothing. We went back through Grandpa's business records, same result. Rachel then requested HOA minutes from the year the lease expired. One entry caught her attention. The minutes said management had confirmed continuity of the master lease arrangement. That's corporate language for saying something without saying what actually happened. 1 month later, the ground rent expense fished from Willow Creek's operating budget. Pamela Cross was already HOA president. We scheduled a meeting. That was the clubhouse meeting from the beginning of this story. 5 board members, Scott Daniels, 2 attorneys, 3 homeowners who had already heard enough rumors to look worried before anyone sat down, and me. Rachel unfolded the county map. The thick boundary line surrounded essentially the entire developed neighborhood. 318 homes, clubhouse, pool, courts, roads, lake, playground. The underlying tract still traced back to Harrison family land holdings. Pamela's first reaction was denial. Her second was anger. Her third was to make the homeowners the shield. "You can't come in here threatening 300 families." I told her I wasn't. "We're trying to determine what agreement actually exists." She pointed across the table at me like she'd caught me sneaking through a window. "You just claimed you own the neighborhood." "No, I said my family still owns the master tract. Those are not the same statement." Rachel stepped in before Pamela and I turned a title review into a bad daytime television show. Then Pamela's attorney produced the supposed 50-year extension. Rachel examined it. The version in front of us had a later execution date, 11 months after Grandpa died. Pamela's face changed. Scott Daniels opened his laptop. "Pamela, I think there's something in the archive." She told him not to open it, which, naturally, made everyone in the room want it opened. The folder was called Harrison Land Control. Inside were old drafts, maps, correspondence, title support files. One document had been created 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. Another folder was named Ochre Repple Place. Even Pamela's attorney looked at her differently after that. Scott opened it with the board's approval. A memo appeared. It described the lease problem 6 years earlier in plain English. Original lease expired. Extension incomplete. Harrison refusing waiver. Ground rent unresolved. Potential homeowner sales and lender problems if the issue became public. Then came the proposed strategies. Negotiate with Benjamin, buy the tract, seek judicial clarification, or establish what the memo called a successor ownership entity. The proposed company name was Harrison Land Management LLC. It was not my grandfather's company. It was not part of the estate. Nobody in our family had created it. The proposed manager was listed as Thomas Harrison. "Who's Thomas?" Rachel asked. I looked at Andrew. He looked at me. I said, "Not anyone in my family." The next document called Thomas a nephew and successor representative of Benjamin Harrison. That was completely false. Then Pamela made her first major mistake. She said, "That transfer was never completed." Rachel looked up. Frank Miller, one of the board members, did too. Frank asked, "How do you know it wasn't completed?" Pamela stopped talking. Her lawyer quietly suggested she continue doing that. Scott kept scrolling. There were templates for successor affidavits, ground rent waivers, lease certifications, title support letters, even a scanned identification card for Thomas Harrison. Older man, Helena address. Nobody recognized him. Rachel did not accuse anyone of fraud. She didn't need to. She simply asked the board to preserve every file exactly as it existed. That was the first practical decision that mattered. Digital evidence can change accidentally or conveniently once people know someone is looking for it. The takeaway was simple. When records may decide ownership, preserve the originals before arguing about what the copies mean. We left that meeting knowing one thing. The expired lease was no longer the strangest part of the problem. Somebody had created a Harrison who didn't belong to the Harrison family, and Pamela already knew more about him than she wanted to admit. Outside the clubhouse, I stood beside Rachel while landscaping crews worked 30 yards away. You could smell freshly cut grass. Sprinklers ticked across a median. A delivery van stopped at a house. The normality of it bothered me. 318 families were eating lunch, paying bills, taking kids to practice, probably arguing about whose turn it was to clean the garage. And underneath all of that was a land problem old enough to have grandchildren. I asked Rachel the question I knew homeowners would ask. Does this mean they're trespassing? No. Good. It means it's complicated. Lawyers enjoy that word because it pays by the hour. But she was right. Individual homeowners could have deeded interests. Lenders had mortgage rights. Title insurers might have obligations. Development agreements could create protections that survived pieces of the original lease arrangement. I did not suddenly own 318 houses, nor did I want to. I wanted to know what Grandpa owned, what Willow Creek had been entitled to use, what had expired, and whether somebody had cheated either side. Claire and I drove to the main ranch that afternoon. Bill Foster, a 68-year-old cattleman who leased pasture from Grandpa for years, saw me checking the same gate latch 3 times. Land trouble? How'd you know? You've inspected that gate like it's about to testify. I told him some of it. When I mentioned Willow Creek, he nodded. Ben hated that deal. The neighborhood? No. The people who kept changing the deal. Bill remembered Grandpa complaining that Willow Creek had expanded beyond the early development plan. That was new. He also remembered something else. A metal box in the north equipment barn. Blue cabinet. Old lease records. We drove there. The barn smelled like dust, old grease, and mouse territory. Bill reached over a beam, found a key, and opened a cabinet I'd walked past twice. Inside were binders, rolled maps, a cash box, and Grandpa's handwritten notebook. I sat on an overturned bucket and started reading. The early entries tracked ordinary development business, payments, expansion requests, meetings. Then the tone changed. Grandpa wrote that additional sections required more rent and land payments. He recorded meetings with Pamela Cross directly. One entry from 7 years earlier was unmistakable. Pamela brought a renewal proposal. Grandpa refused it. His note said the terms surrendered rent and gave too much control. 2 weeks later, Pamela reportedly told him the board intended to proceed based on what she called the existing understanding. Grandpa wrote one word beneath it in capital letters: no. Then Thomas appeared in the notebook. A man using that name had contacted Grandpa, claiming some distant family connection and asking about Track 6. Grandpa rejected him. Later entry: Thomas is not family. Another told Pamela directly he has no authority. Then Grandpa suffered his stroke. Months passed. His handwriting came back shakier. The final entry involving Pamela was made roughly 4 months before his death. She apparently told him the lease matter had been handled through Thomas. Grandpa wrote that he had warned her again. If they used Thomas's documents after that warning, they were doing it knowingly. I sat there holding the notebook with both hands. That was the first moment I felt genuinely angry. Not because I suddenly knew Pamela had committed some specific crime. I didn't. But Grandpa had spent his final years trying to tell people the same thing I was now discovering. The man wasn't family. The lease wasn't settled. The land wasn't theirs to transfer. Rachel came out that evening. We scanned everything. One old development map showed approximately 212 home sites in the original footprint. Later sections B and C added more than 100 additional homes. Attached agreements indicated those expansions required updated financial terms. We couldn't find proof that everything Grandpa claimed was due had been paid. Then Rachel opened the metal cash box. Inside was a drafted, certified letter that Grandpa apparently never mailed. Its tone was firm, but not destructive. He disputed the expansion. He disputed the lease renewal. He rejected the false successor authority. But he also said he was willing to negotiate a legitimate agreement. That mattered to me. Grandpa wasn't trying to bulldoze Willow Creek. He wanted people to stop pretending the problem didn't exist. Rachel sent formal preservation notices. Willow Creek retained an outside title firm. The board temporarily removed Pamela from handling the land review. Residents were notified that a title investigation was underway, but there was no immediate threat to occupancy. Then a Willow Creek homeowner named Stephen Moore came to my ranch with his wife. They looked scared. "We heard you're taking the neighborhood." "I'm not." Pamela said you were. Of course she did. Stephen's wife asked me, are you going to make us leave? No. Her shoulders dropped. That reaction stayed with me. The documents were complicated. Fear was simple. So I asked Rachel for an open homeowner meeting. Pamela objected. Her own board approved it anyway. And that meeting gave us the first person who remembered seeing Thomas Harrison in the room. The Saturday meeting overflowed the clubhouse. People stood along the walls and outside the doors. I kept my remarks short. I inherited the Harrison property. One of those tracts is the underlying master parcel associated with Willow Creek. There is a serious question about whether the old ground lease was ever validly extended. The whispering started immediately, so I added the part that mattered most. I'm not here to remove anyone from a home. That quieted the room. A woman asked whether residents would suddenly owe me rent. I don't know what the final arrangement should be yet. Not a crowd-pleasing answer, but honest beats reassuring fiction. I told them that if a new agreement became necessary, it would be negotiated with representatives of the community openly. Then someone asked about the questionable lease signature. I didn't say Pamela forged it. I didn't say Willow Creek had committed fraud. I said it was being reviewed. Rachel had been very clear about that. Facts first, accusations later if facts earned them. Then an older homeowner stood near the back. Harold Benson. I remember Thomas Harrison. Pamela was on her feet before I could respond. Harold, that's not relevant. Half the room turned toward her. You could almost hear the collective thought, well, now it's definitely relevant. Harold said Thomas had attended HOA meetings around 6 years earlier. He remembered Pamela introducing him as someone representing the Harrison interests. Scott Daniels looked down at his laptop. Then he said the old management archive might contain recordings. Years earlier, some board members had attended meetings remotely, so sessions were recorded. When management companies changed, backups had been copied to a server nobody had touched in years. Scott checked the date. He found a recording. Then his expression changed. There is something in here you all need to know. Rachel immediately told him not to play a phone copy in the room. She wanted the original preserved with metadata intact. That might sound overly cautious until you remember we were already dealing with documents whose dates had apparently moved around like furniture during a divorce. If a digital recording may become evidence, preserve the original file and its metadata before editing, forwarding, or converting it. Scott summarized one piece. Thomas had told the board Benjamin Harrison was dead. I felt something tighten in my chest. When? Scott gave me the meeting date. Grandpa had been alive for almost 5 more years after that meeting. Pamela said it must have been a misunderstanding. Harold shook his head. He remembered board members offering condolences. He remembered Thomas saying he now handled the family side. Pamela's attorney shut the discussion down until everyone could review the original recording properly. That was fine with me. I didn't need a dramatic confession. I needed evidence that survived daylight. The following morning, Rachel asked me to come to her office. Andrew was already there. The old video filled a large monitor, poor image, flat conference room lighting, audio that crackled every time someone moved a paper. Pamela sat at the front table. Then a man entered carrying a leather folder. He introduced himself as Thomas Harrison. A board member asked about Benjamin. Thomas said Benjamin had passed away and he was handling the Harrison family's interests. Nobody corrected him. Pamela didn't either. Another board member asked if he had authority to extend the ground arrangement. Thomas said yes. Rachel paused the video. We found no power of attorney, no probate appointment, no family relationship. She resumed it. Thomas distributed documents, a lease confirmation, a succession acknowledgement. Then he signed his own name beneath a title describing him as a successor representative. Pamela signed as witness. That detail mattered because the later version of the lease file said Pamela had witnessed my grandfather's signature. The story had changed over time. On the video, it was Thomas. On the later document, somehow it became Benjamin. Then a treasurer asked the question that explained the money. If we do this, does annual ground rent stop? Thomas said the successor entity wanted a one-time settlement. How much? $600,000. There was the exact amount Willow Creek had later claimed Grandpa received. Except this recording showed the money was supposed to go to Thomas's entity, not Grandpa. Thomas provided banking instructions. Pamela told the board the arrangement would secure long-term stability, 50 years. The board voted 5-1 to approve the $600,000 settlement, subject to legal confirmation. Rachel froze the video on those words. Subject to legal confirmation. I asked, did anybody confirm him? We haven't found that yet. Then she opened a bank record. 3 months after the meeting, Willow Creek transferred the entire $600 to Harrison Land Management LLC. The fake Harrison company had actually been paid, and it had been created only 6 weeks before Thomas walked into that clubhouse. The money did not stay in the account for long. Rachel laid the transactions across her conference table. $240,000 went to Western Development Advisory Group. $210,000 went to Prairie Holdings Consulting. $145,000 remained in a Harrison Land Management operating account. About $5,000 disappeared into ordinary fees and expenses. Who owns those companies? I asked. We're tracing them. Another archived recording gave us something just as important as the money. 4 weeks before the payment, Pamela, Thomas, and former property manager Dennis Wallace had met privately. The recording picked up halfway through. Dennis was demanding direct confirmation from Grandpa. Thomas told him that wasn't going to happen. Dennis pushed back. Benjamin owned the land. Thomas claimed he had authority anyway. Dennis asked Pamela whether she had actually verified that authority. She didn't answer on the recording. That mattered. Whatever else Pamela might later say, somebody inside Willow Creek had questioned Thomas before the $600,000 left the account. Then Rachel found the pressure point that may have made his story so attractive. A major lender connected to dozens of Willow Creek mortgages had been asking for proof that the ground lease remained active. Without clean documentation, future buyers could have trouble obtaining mortgages. Refinancing could slow down. Sales could become difficult. Values could take a hit. Now the timing made sense. The legitimate landowner was demanding new terms. The old developer had disappeared. The lease had expired. And right in the middle of that mess, Thomas arrived offering 50 years of certainty for $600,000. Convenient is not the same thing as true, but convenient can be extremely persuasive when people are afraid. Then the outside investigation finally identified Thomas. His real name was Victor Lane, 64, former commercial real estate broker, living in Nevada. No relation to Benjamin Harrison, no relationship to me, no place in our estate. And Victor had previously worked with Western Development Advisory Group, the company that received $240,000 from the fake Harrison entity. So the man presenting himself as a Harrison successor was financially connected to one of the companies receiving the settlement money. That changed the balance completely. Before that, Willow Creek could argue that everyone had made an old paperwork mistake. After that, we had a false identity, a freshly created company, a $600,000 transfer, questionable succession documents, and internal evidence showing authority had been challenged before payment. The board fully suspended Pamela as president. Frank Miller became acting president. And then Frank called me with the question I'd been trying not to answer. If this all gets corrected, what are you going to demand? Money. There it was. 7 years of unpaid ground rent. Expansion obligations. Interest. Future land value. On paper, the numbers could become brutal. 318 homes sat on 247 acres near a growing city. I could have treated that fact like a weapon. Instead, I remembered Grandpa's unfinished letter. Negotiate honestly. That was when I decided the people who bought homes in Willow Creek were not going to pay for every bad decision other people had made before they ever knew there was a problem. Rachel and I stopped treating the dispute like a single lawsuit waiting to happen. We treated it like a construction problem. You don't fix a failing structure by swinging a hammer randomly because you're angry at the crack. You find the load, you find the failure, then you support the right thing. Our first job was title. Who actually owned Track 6, not who claimed to, not whose company name looked convincing. The county chain still pointed back to Harrison Family Land Holdings. Second was the lease. The 30-year term had expired 7 years earlier. We had not found a valid 50-year extension. Third was the money. Where did the $600,000 go and who authorized it? Fourth was evidence preservation. Old management server, meeting recordings, emails, corporate filings, notary history, estate records, Grandpa's notebook. Fifth was the practical future, because even if I proved every historical point, I would still wake up the next morning with 318 families living on a tract tied to my inheritance. Frank came to Rachel's office with representatives from Willow Creek. His question surprised me. What would Benjamin have wanted? I looked down at a copy of Grandpa's unfinished certified letter. He wanted a legitimate agreement. Then let's build one. We laid out 4 paths. A new long-term ground lease. That would preserve the old structure, but gradually update the rent. A direct HOA purchase of the underlying developed land. A collective homeowner buyout. Or a hybrid settlement combining HOA reserves, title insurance coverage, and structured future payments. Rachel also contacted the title insurer. Years of transactions had relied on lease and ownership representations that now appeared defective. If insured title work had incorporated bad documents, coverage could matter. That did not guarantee the insurer would happily write a check. Insurance companies don't usually wake up hoping for character development, but the claim needed to be made. Another practical point became important: independent valuation. I didn't want my appraiser telling Willow Creek what my land was worth, while their appraiser told me it was worth half that. If we reached the buyout stage, both sides would need outside numbers they could defend. In a property dispute, a clean chain of title, preserved evidence, proper insurance notice, and independent valuation are worth more than 100 angry emails. For the first time, we could see a solution that did not involve pretending residents were the enemy. Then the county title office called. They had found another deed. I drove to Rachel's office. The document was a quitclaim deed. Grantor, Harrison Land Management LLC. Grantee, Willow Creek Community Holdings Inc. Property, Tract 6. All 247 acres. I stared at it. How can Harrison Land Management transfer land it never owned? That's the issue. A quitclaim deed does not create ownership out of thin air. It transfers whatever interest the grantor actually has. If the grantor owns nothing, the fancy paper still transfers nothing. But this deed had been recorded, and recorded documents create confidence, confusion, and sometimes expensive mistakes. The deed had been filed roughly 1 month after the $600,000 payment. Then Rachel pulled the corporate registration for Willow Creek Community Holdings. Directors included Pamela Cross, Victor Lane, and Dennis Wallace. Dennis, the same property manager whose warnings on the video had made him look like the cautious person in the room. His name was on the entity that supposedly received my family's 247 acres. That was bad enough. Then Rachel opened the latest annual filing. Community Holdings was still claiming control of approximately 247 acres beneath Willow Creek. Then she showed me a loan application. $12 million, collateral. Tract 6. The application had been submitted 3 weeks earlier, after Grandpa died, after I inherited the estate. Pamela Cross had signed it as president of Willow Creek Community Holdings. Closing was scheduled for Monday. It was Friday. We had spent weeks patiently reconstructing a mess that had existed for years. Now somebody was 48 hours away from borrowing $12 million against the disputed land. Patience was still useful, but it was time to move. Can they close? I asked. Rachel shook her head. Not if the lender knows there's a serious title dispute. Do they know? They're about to. She didn't call the local branch. She didn't ask for a loan officer. She contacted the lender's legal department. That's a small detail, but it mattered. Customer service can apologize. Legal can stop money. Rachel sent a concise package. My inheritance documents, the original Harrison chain of title, the expired lease, Grandpa's correspondence, the false successor material, Victor Lane's identity, the $600,000 settlement trail, the quitclaim deed from an entity that had never established ownership, the community holdings records, and the pending loan documents. No threats. No speeches. One issue. The proposed collateral was subject to an active ownership and title dispute. Then we waited. The office was quiet except for air conditioning and the occasional click of Rachel's keyboard. 38 minutes later, the lender responded. Closing suspended. Not postponed for a few hours. Suspended pending independent title review. No $12 million would move Monday morning. I sat back. For weeks, Pamela had acted as though authority came from the confidence with which she said things. Then one documented notice to the right department stopped a $12 million transaction cold. That is the difference between making noise and creating leverage. The lender freeze also forced everyone to examine Willow Creek Community Holdings, and that brought us back to Dennis. Andrew called him. Nothing. Called again. Still nothing. Then Dennis's attorney contacted Rachel. Dennis would cooperate. The next morning he appeared by video with counsel. He looked tired before anyone asked the first question. Rachel started with the corporate filing. Were you a director of Willow Creek Community Holdings? Yes. Did you know the company received a quitclaim deed for Tract 6? Eventually, yes. Did you believe Harrison Land Management owned Tract 6? No. That answer landed hard. I leaned closer to the screen. Then why was your name on the company? Dennis rubbed his forehead. Pamela had told him Community Holdings would temporarily hold documents while attorneys cleaned up the lease and successor issue. He said he never invested money. Never received money, never signed the quitclaim deed. He had signed an initial director consent because he believed the entity was temporary. Then the fake successor deal advanced. The $600,000 moved. The deed appeared. Dennis objected. Rachel asked the question that mattered. Did you put your objection in writing? Dennis reached for a folder. Yes, he had kept personal copies, emails, letters. His resignation. One message to Pamela was especially clear. Subject line, "It-alone deed do not use." His email warned that Harrison Land Management had never demonstrated ownership of Tract 6, and therefore could not solve the master lease problem merely by signing a quitclaim deed. He specifically warned against presenting that deed to lenders, buyers, title companies, or residents as proof Willow Creek owned the master tract. The date was 6 years earlier. Pamela replied that counsel was handling title continuity and community holdings provided adequate interim control. Dennis asked which counsel. According to him, she never identified one. He resigned 3 weeks later. I was angry with him. You knew for years, yes. And you stayed quiet. Yes. He didn't defend himself. That helped more than an excuse would have. Dennis said he'd been afraid. If the ground lease problem became public, he believed sales could collapse and homeowners could lose value. So he'd convinced himself delay was protecting people. It wasn't. It was letting the defect grow. Then he told us Victor's original pitch. Victor knew the old Western Valley records. He knew the lease had expired. He knew Grandpa wanted new financial terms. His proposed solution was elegant if you ignored the little problem that it wasn't real. Create a Harrison-sounding company. Present Victor as family successor. Take a one-time settlement. Then transfer the supposed interest into a community-controlled entity. On paper, the problem disappears. In reality, the actual owner never transferred anything. And Dennis said there had been another reason Pamela liked the idea: potential profit. 6 years earlier, a regional builder had approached Willow Creek about roughly 40 acres along the eastern side of Tract 6. The proposed price was about $4 million. There was a problem. Grandpa owned the land. He refused the sale. According to Dennis, Victor suggested that if community holdings could establish apparent control of the master tract, Willow Creek might eventually be able to sell or develop acreage itself. That changed how I saw Pamela's decisions. Fear of collapsing property values could explain why someone wanted a quick fix. It did not explain continuing to rely on bad ownership claims once warnings had piled up. And the possible development deal introduced something more than fear. There was upside. The 40-acre sale never closed. A title insurer refused to insure the transaction. That was probably one of the best decisions anyone made in this entire story. Yet the bad deed stayed in the record. Why? Because nobody forced the underlying issue. Houses continued to sell. Mortgages continued to close. Routine transactions relied on layers of documents that looked official enough. Most people never traced the master title back 3 decades. Why would they? You buy a house, you assume the people collecting HOA dues and issuing architectural rules have at least checked who owns the ground under the clubhouse. Apparently, that expectation was ambitious. Then my grandfather died. I inherited the property. And Willow Creek's automated compliance system sent me a $500 weed fine. I still laughed whenever I thought about it. This thing had survived management changes, lender reviews, thousands of pages of closing documents, multiple companies, and 6 years of silence. And what finally exposed it? Some software decided the actual landowner needed to mow better. By Monday, the $12 million loan was formally dead. Not merely on hold, the lender withdrew. Then Willow Creek's board held an emergency vote. Pamela Cross was removed as president, unanimously. Frank Miller became temporary president. He called me afterward. I want to fix this. So do I. No shell companies. Good. No mystery relatives. Even better. No pretending the lease fixed itself. Now we're getting somewhere. Pamela's removal did not erase what had happened. It did change the atmosphere. For the first time, Willow Creek leadership stopped treating me like an intruder trying to steal a neighborhood and started treating the title problem as something real people had to solve. Dennis continued cooperating. His records helped connect the timing. Thomas, Victor arrived. Authority was questioned. The settlement was approved. The money transferred. The defective deed appeared. Dennis protested. Pamela told him not to alarm residents. Years later, Community Holdings still relied on that supposed ownership when Pamela signed the $12 million loan application. That chain mattered. It showed the difference between one bad judgment made under pressure and a problem repeatedly carried forward. Victor's companies became part of broader civil and criminal investigations related to the false identity and financial documents. I didn't control those investigations. I didn't try to. My job was the land. Rachel filed the necessary action to clear the title chain. Willow Creek's outside counsel reviewed the same evidence we had, and, importantly, they did not fight the basic ownership conclusion. Harrison Land Management had never owned Tract 6. A quitclaim from a non-owner could not magically make Community Holdings the owner. The recorded deed created a defect in the paperwork. It did not replace the underlying title. Harrison Family Land Holdings remained the record owner. Grandpa held that interest when he died. I inherited it. Once that was accepted, we could stop fighting over imaginary ownership and deal with the real question. What should happen to Willow Creek now? Frank assembled 6 homeowner representatives, young families, retirees, people with mortgages, people planning to sell, people who wanted to remain there forever. One woman, Laura Mitchell, said something I liked immediately. Whatever we sign, residents need to understand it before the signatures go on. I agreed. No hidden fix. No technical language designed to make everybody stop asking questions. If we were cleaning up 30 years of history, we were going to do it in daylight. The most satisfying meeting wasn't the one where Pamela was removed. It came later, after the title work had been assembled into something ordinary homeowners could actually follow. The clubhouse was full again. This time nobody was whispering about whether I planned to evict them. Large copies of the county map sat on easels. Rachel had prepared a simple chronology: original Harrison ownership, 30-year ground lease, lease expiration, no valid extension in the estate or county record, false successor entity, $600,000 payment, recorded quitclaim deed, community holdings, pending $12 million loan, lender freeze, each step connected to a document. That was the trap, if you want to call it that. Not mud, not chains across a road, not a sheriff waiting behind a building. Paper, dates, recorded ownership, bank transfers, original video. The more calmly Rachel laid it out, the worse the shortcuts looked. Frank addressed the homeowners first. He told them the outside title lawyers had reached the same central conclusion as my attorneys. Community Holdings did not hold legitimate title to Tract 6, merely because a defective deed had been recorded. The Harrison interest had never been validly transferred through that chain. Then Dennis stood. Nobody made him. He could have submitted a letter. Instead, he faced the room. He said he'd known years earlier that the successor arrangement had serious problems. He'd warned Pamela in writing. Then he'd resigned and allowed himself to believe leaving the job meant leaving the responsibility. It didn't. He admitted fear had influenced him. He was afraid that exposing an expired ground lease would damage mortgages, sales, and families who had done nothing wrong. So I told myself silence was protecting the neighborhood. He looked around. It wasn't. That was his apology. No dramatic redemption, no applause. Just a man admitting he'd waited too long to say what he knew. I respected that more than I expected. Pamela's own position had already collapsed under the documents. Grandpa's notebook showed warnings. Archived meetings showed Thomas's authority being questioned. Dennis's email told her directly not to use the quitclaim deed as proof of ownership. Yet Community Holdings continued claiming control. And after Grandpa's actual death, Pamela signed the $12 million loan application using Tract 6 as collateral. She hadn't simply inherited an old mistake. She had carried it forward. Victor Lane, meanwhile, was no longer Thomas Harrison in anyone's file except the evidence copies. His connection to the fake entity and the money trail was being handled elsewhere. My dispute with Willow Creek did not need a movie ending. It needed a correct title. Rachel explained the legal point in one sentence everyone could understand. A person or company cannot convey an ownership interest it never possessed. The quitclaim deed did not make Willow Creek the owner. The court action would clear the false chain. Then Frank turned toward me. "What do you want now?" A year earlier, maybe that question would have sounded like an invitation to name a number. Now I looked around the room. 318 households, people who had paid mortgages, people who had bought in good faith, people who had received HOA violations for paint colors and trash cans, while the association itself couldn't prove the ground arrangement under the subdivision. Life has a sense of humor, I said. I want a real agreement. No applause at first, just quiet. Then I explained that I wasn't demanding immediate market ground rent. I wasn't trying to make families pay every dollar associated with decisions they never made. But the land could not remain trapped in fake companies and some expired documents. Laura raised her hand. "Can we buy it?" That's one of the options. That changed the room. The conversation stopped being about who had lied 6 years ago. It became about what Willow Creek could build honestly now. And that was the point where Pamela's entire strategy finally failed. For years, the solution had been to make reality less visible. Our solution was the opposite. Put every fact on the table, then let 318 families decide what they wanted to do with the truth. The negotiations lasted months. Nobody loved every number. That's usually how you know a real settlement has been negotiated. We calculated 7 years of unpaid ground rent. We addressed the old expansion issues. Title insurance came into the discussion. So did HOA reserves. I agreed to reduce part of what could have been demanded in exchange for a permanent solution. Some obligations would be paid over time. Then came the big decision. Renew another ground lease or buy the land. Willow Creek residents overwhelmingly preferred ownership. I understood why. After living through a 50-year extension disaster, nobody wanted to leave another lease expiration puzzle for their grandchildren. We ordered independent appraisals, 2 separate firms, then a third review. The 247 acres had real value, but Willow Creek didn't need all of it. We separated the developed residential footprint and necessary common areas from the western open acreage. The final structure was straightforward. Willow Creek would purchase the land needed beneath the existing neighborhood and common facilities. I would retain the undeveloped western strip as part of Harrison Ranch. The purchase would be staged so homeowners weren't hit with one massive assessment. Title insurance contributed substantially because earlier transactions had relied on defective documents. Willow Creek also recovered part of the old $600 SUSA through claims and settlement efforts. Victor Lane's companies remained tied up in separate investigations over the false identity and financial documents. Pamela faced consequences of her own. I did not attend every proceeding. By then, I was tired of rooms with folders in them. But the documentary record was what it was. Warnings, questioned authority, bad title claims. And years later, her signature on a $12 million loan application using land community holdings did not truly own. Dennis cooperated fully. Nobody pretended he had handled everything correctly. At a public meeting, he admitted that fear had kept him quiet. That accountability mattered. The final Willow Creek land purchase took nearly 14 months. On signing day, Claire sat beside me. Andrew was there, Rachel, Frank, Laura, other homeowner representatives. The title company staff placed the documents in front of us. I signed, the actual owner. Frank signed for Willow Creek. The title company recorded a clean agreement. No invented nephew, no successor shell, no dead man supposedly signing paperwork from the grave. Just people who were actually authorized to sign. Laura looked at Rachel afterward. So we can finally say we own the ground under our homes? Rachel smiled. Yes, the room applauded. I did too. That surprised me. I had inherited 1,800 acres. The strangest part of that inheritance turned out to be 318 houses sitting on 247 acres, governed by an expired lease and years of increasingly creative paperwork. Yet the best outcome wasn't taking more. It was finally making ownership boring. Boring is underrated. The western land I kept stayed open and became part of the ranch again. I leased it at a fair rate to a local cattle family. Willow Creek and I signed a short maintenance agreement covering a road edge and drainage area we still shared. 7 pages. You can actually read 7 pages without needing provisions and a sleeping bag. Frank also started sending us a Christmas basket every year. The first card thanked me for not evicting 318 families. Claire laughed so hard she had to sit down. I sent one back thanking Willow Creek for finally checking who owned its ground. We became neighbors after that, not best friends. Neighbors is enough. And every once in a while, I still think about the one event that started my part of the investigation. Not the $600,000, not the fake successor, not the $12 million loan, a $500 vegetation fine. The HOA tried to find the man who actually owned the master tract underneath its own neighborhood. That small piece of automated authority opened the door to everything else. So if you've ever had an HOA letter make you stare at the page and say, "They can't possibly mean this, tell me what happened." And if you enjoy stories where paperwork, patience, and a little persistence finally catch up with bad decisions, subscribe and stay with us. Some problems get bigger because nobody checks the first document. This one got solved because eventually somebody did. You know, the detail I keep coming back to isn't the $12 million loan. It's that $500 vegetation fine. Jacob could have treated that letter like most people would. Get mad, make a phone call, pay it just to make the headache disappear, whatever. Instead, he started checking the paperwork, and once he did, the whole thing changed. Not quickly, not dramatically. It took months of records, old meeting files, title work, lawyers, and some people finally admitting what they knew. That's usually how these situations really move. I'd be curious what you would have done in Jacob's position. Once you learned 318 families were caught in the middle, would you have pushed for every dollar you could get, or tried to build the kind of deal he did? Tell me in the comments. And if you like these HOA stories, give the video a like, subscribe to the HOA Layabi, and share this one with somebody who's ever received a ridiculous HOA notice. Because sometimes the most expensive paperwork problem in the room starts with the cheapest little fine.